that are in postdoc, but whatever. All right, it's been a while. Well, it hasn't been that well, right? Like, what was it when we did the reading on I forget the name of the Chinese scholar we were reading an article about, but that was like what, a month and a half ago or something. Yeah, it wasn't that long ago. Uh, and I did actually talk I did actually talk about doing more of these because like now I can, but we just never did. Even though we have read some stuff. We just what is it? Well, we like what stuff have we read? I think we've read a couple of articles and we just decided like maybe we were gonna record something and then we decided not to because it just wasn't very interesting. But anyways, I want to read and obviously comment on this article, Existentialist Hero versus Ordinary Language of Man, Iris Murdoch, Confronting Sartre and Wittgenstein. I have not read this entirely through so far, but I found it interesting enough. Uh, it connects to some things that I've been thinking about on and off over time. Particularly, it's well, we can just get into it and we'll see what it's about. I think it's interesting that it starts with a framing of morality, so that's always on people's minds. So let's go. A quick summary of Iris Murdoch's contributions to the discussion of morality would go like this. In the turbulent time after World War II, when Western moral philosophy became obsessed with the moment of ethical choice and the role of the will in deciding appropriate moral actions, Murdoch proposed a shift of the will. Sorry about that. Murdoch proposed a shift of focus to the moral agent's inner efforts to curb the solipsist human ego, construct a just vision of particular external reality, and cultivate a finer sensitivity to perceive the particularity of another human being in a non-violent and loving way. It is thus quite convenient and fitting indeed to identify Murdoch as a typical early member of the contemporary virtue ethics group, the character of which is the emphasis on virtuous, personal character rather than laudable choices of action, often assessed abstractly, on understanding the particularity and complexity of lived human situations rather than upholding certain unchallengeable moral principles. So, being about virtue ethics, that's already interesting enough. There's, if you look online, like the main philosophical place I visit is two stupid sites. One of them less stupid than the other. The less stupid one is a subreddit called Ask Philosophy, where you can sort of see what the general Western layman's, particularly European, Anglo-European, Anglo-American people are thinking about and what they have on their minds. And you very, very rarely see virtue ever discussed when it comes to moral issues. The default is mainly utilitarianism, consequentialism. Anglo-consequentialism. Right, Tree?
Mm-hmm.
And I do think that's an apt description and or a qualifier on consequentialism, because consequentialism is mostly an Anglo standpoint. And there's the rare Kantian deontologists, not so rare but still very rare compared to the utilitarians. And you basically very rarely see anybody actually mention virtue. It's very much unheard of, even though it's a pretty significantly talked about standpoint, at least in modern ethics. When I was taking my first philosophy classes, at least one of the few things that came up, even though it didn't come up in a very well explained way. So that's interesting. And then I've been recently reading about Confucianism and early Chinese philosophy, and that had to do a lot with virtues as well. Although it's not exactly the same thing as Greek virtues, like Aristotelian virtue theory. Although I think it's in many ways also related. Like it's still a very richly concrete uh, way of looking at things. Particularly, it's definitely about the particularity and complexity of lived human situations, rather than these abstract moral principles. So, continuing. Such summary and labeling, although helpful in providing a quick sketch of Murdoch's moral reflections, hardly touch the significance of her accomplishments in the post-war intellectual field, which lies not so much in the originality of her moral conclusions per se, as in her overall evaluation of the foundations of the widely held moral views in the Western world shortly after the war. Put another way, the significance of Murdoch's moral reflections, together with that of the entire trend of virtue ethics, the background and cause of its increasing influence today, could be properly understood only if we are aware of Murdoch's critique of the foundational thoughts of the popular moral views. To be able to get there, we have to go in depth and detail across the wide range of intellectual artistic fields of her writing. So, I don't know anything about Iris Murdoch, but anybody who ranges over the intellectual and artistic is interesting to me, just on that account. It's already a non-analytic way of dealing with things, and I am not a fan of analytic philosophy. One manageable way to untangle Murdoch's moral critique is to divide it into three layers. On the first layer, Murdoch confronts head-on with Sartre and Wittgenstein by pointing out what has gone wrong in the moral assumptions of these two influential figures in the continental and Anglophone philosophical circles at the time. Murdoch diagnoses the post-war Western moral field as based on solipsist and conventional understandings of human life. They fail to pay sufficient tribute to the particularity of other human beings. The most effective means to rectify moral understandings, however, lies not in developing a more satisfying philosophical system, but in the practice of a certain type of literature. On the second layer, Murdoch proceeds to critique the liberal tradition behind the post-war moral assumptions summed up as existentialist, utilitarian, behaviorist in nature. The liberal tradition, influenced greatly by Kant, holds an all too facile view on freedom and on human moral life, which results in the restriction of moral issues to the narrow field of the will and choice or action. Murdoch, in its stead, proposes a more complex model of moral improvement, one that is based on the Platonic concepts of inner vision and love, eros. On the deepest layer, Murdoch goes further to critique the long-held meta-ethical stance of humanism that man is the measure of all things that culminates in existentialist hubris. In this last stage, later Murdoch veers more and more to mysticism, emphasizing the mystic guide of the good. We will now follow Iris Murdoch's trajectory of critique, layer by layer. The whole task needs 2 essays to complete. In the present essay, we will focus on the first, an initiative layer, on Murdoch's confrontation with Sartre and Wittgenstein's thought. Her critique of the two prominent figures in the post-war intellectual circle triggers her entire endeavors to develop a better picture of people's moral life. Wow, that's very interesting. I think this is the first time I've noticed here in Epoche that somebody said, this is going to be a part of a 2-part series. I was actually thinking I should have done that with my animal thing, my thing on animal ethics. It was too long, yet not long enough about what I wanted to say. Like, I ended up giving the account of the basis for the moral judgment about an ethical relationship to animals, which is not precisely ethical, but still normative. But then I didn't get to it, give much of a positive account at all about what I thought in stronger details was consequential to that. There was an aspect of it in which I mentioned at the beginning of my article how it would seem as if the standpoint I was taking was only going to allow for an indirect set of duties to animals. But then I also qualified that in that same opening paragraph with saying that in many ways these indirect duties are also clearly understandable as direct duties. But the essay got way too long, and I had to cut that short on what exactly that that direct duty seemed to entail.
Oh, you cut out the part about... Because
Ontological
I remember
sympathy.
there was...
Yeah, there was a part about ontological sympathy, and there was a part that I was going to add about, what was it? The regard to nature itself, like even beyond animals, how you just cannot just wantonly destroy nature. It's also implicit in Kant's view. Kant actually talked about it, which I was very pleased to find out, because I came up with that on my own independent speculation, but that also needed to be accounted for.
Yeah, I remember reading something from an early draft for you talking about how it makes sense that we would want to let animals be free, in a sense. It's kind
Yeah.
of like the drive behind like conservationism to an extent.
Yeah. That's. I would say that's definitely part of the drive of conservationism. Is just the idea that we should just kind of let nature be nature, even if it's in these closed off, enclosed areas. But then again, I think Iremy has a great point talking about he said that multiple times on like Twitter, and then I think he has he had a discussion he did on his YouTube channel about that, about how nature is no longer really just natural. Even conservation doesn't leave it as mere nature anymore.
Yeah, I remember like that little thing by Bookchin also made like the same argument about nature.
Oh God, don't remind me of Bookchin.
Yeah, sorry, but that's the only like good point I remember.
Yeah, I
From
mean,
that.
it's not that he didn't say anything good. It's just like I found it so boring. I was like, yeah.
We're not hearing much about him lately, which I guess is good.
Yeah, I guess the meme died out. There was a bit in which, like, I saw that meme, and people who were on Ironics, like, have you read Murray Bookchin? Like, I got emails from people back in the day. What do you think about Murray's on dialectics? I'm like, ain't very good. But anyways, that's completely tangential to this. All right, continuing. So Murdoch was once a fan of Sartre's. As a spirited young woman, in 1945, she could barely hold her excitement when she attended one of Sartre's lectures to get his autograph. Yet by the time her first book came out in 1953, Murdoch already displayed outright discontent with Sartre's thought. Such discontent later grew into a harsh critique of the whole trend of post-war existentialist philosophy, which Murdoch regarded as fundamentally solipsistic and liable to induce a moral collapse as grim as the concentration camps. I agree. By the way, just go up a little bit up about how where it says on the deepest layer, Murdoch goes further into critique the long-held meta-ethical stance of humanism that man is the measure of all things, that culminates in existential hubris. In this last stage, later Murdoch ever veers more and more into mysticism, emphasizing the mystic guide of the good. One would think that me being what people think is a Hegelian, you'd be like, wow, this is like against everything you believe. Well, not immediately. Depending on how this is developed, I can go like, yeah, I totally agree to, it's right to maybe not completely right. I doubt it would be a point in which I would say, nah, that's completely wrong. So there's not an immediate enmity between these concepts, in my view. Mainly because it seems, at least if you especially look at my animal ethics one, it does seem that I favor humanism, although I don't think it's properly what people think humanism is. Like, it has nothing to do with the human species, really. But anyways, continuing. During her philosophical training at Cambridge in 1947 to 1948, Murdoch met Wittgenstein. Oh, that must have been fun. She then drew immense inspiration from this legendary figure among the post-war Oxbridge philosophical circle, especially from his later ordinary language philosophy. Murdoch considered this to be a preferable alternative to existentialism in its moral assumptions. However, she still found the branch of the moral tradition manifested in Wittgenstein regrettable, for it focused too narrowly on public rules and shared conventions, therefore missed out on a richer field of human life and left no room for a transcendental idea of goodness. Murdoch's first two books express, most explicitly, her reflections on these two philosophers. Both books, although one roughly classified as a philosophical treatise, the other as a novel, are peculiarly ambiguous in nature. They shuttle across the fields of philosophy, literary criticism, and literature without scruples. Sounds good to me. In Sartre, Romantic Rationalist, Murdoch's first book, also the first book discussing Sartre's work in English, Murdoch enters her official critique of Sartre by way of discussing nausea. Shortly after introducing the novel's main plot and ideas, she asks her reader to reflect upon an unexpected question of literary appreciation. What kind of novel is nausea? Murdoch's own answer is, quote, "It seems more like a poem or an incantation than a novel. We find its hero interesting, but we do not find him particularly touching." Sartre says in L'être et le néant, L'être et le néant, that pure introspection does not reveal character. Wittenstein, the protagonist of Nausea, is depicted as so lacking in the normal vanities and interest of a human being as to be rather colorless. Even his sufferings do not move us, for he himself is not their dupe. Well, I have not read Nausea, so I can't say I fully comprehend that reference. This comment, going blatantly astray from philosophical argumentation, ushers in a pivotal moment for laying bare the defects of Sartre's thoughts. The problem with Sartre, revealed here, is first of all the effacement of the concrete individual human characters, despite the central position of the individual subject in Sartre's thought. Sartre pictures the individual subject as a free, isolated, and self-chosen consciousness, yet as a Cartesian solipsist, Sartre exhibits a lack of any lively sense of the mystery and contingent variousness of individuals. Even the individuality of Nausea's only hero is presented with such a crude simplicity that the reader can say little more than that Wittenstein is an excessively transparent consciousness. This fictional characterization fails to move the reader. That sounds pretty boring. I'll say that. Sounds like a not very interesting fellow. Things get worse when Sartre deals with human subjects other than the self, and Murdoch criticizes his solipsism most vehemently on his perception of the other person. Sartrean existentialism slanders, even demonizes the existence of the other. Another person is seen as an alien being whose freedom contradicts one's own and whose unassimilable Medusa gaze threatens to turn one's pour soi into en soi. I assume that's for self into in itself. Hence the failure of sympathy and the impossibility of human companionship. Oh, I did not know that, because I know nothing about Sartre. Being completely open about this here, I am ignorant, and I proclaim my ignorance. But anything that denies the reality of sympathy or empathy and the impossibility of human companionship is definitely extremely wrong. One would even say, and I would dare say, it is evil. Yeah. Going on a tangent, by the way. So I'm on this philosophy Discord channel, which is full of the typical debate bros. You know, people who go into that sphere. And the other day I was there's this guy who wanted to know about Hegel because he's like, I hate Hegel, but you know I don't understand him, so I'd like you to explain something. So I actually spent about an hour or two just chatting with him, trying to explain the way the thinking works and whatnot. And then this guy came in and just completely derailed the conversation into his thing about like how recognition is impossible and you can't know that other people are conscious. and that you can't know that other people or other beings, particularly animals, because somehow animals came up, and then that's what triggered him. Saying that you know I knew that my dog had thoughts and that my dog had feelings. He's like, you don't know that, and I'm like, okay, man, okay. And then we actually got into this whole circular uh, discussion about like how he knew that he had thoughts and feelings, and he's like, well, I know because I just do, and I'm like, well, so do you know or do you not? And then he admitted, he's like, well, I don't. I can't be certain about it. But I'm like, you don't even know what you're talking about, do you? And he's like, well, I don't think anybody can be certain about what we're talking about. Nobody knows what consciousness is. So if you don't know what consciousness is, if you don't know what feelings are, if you don't know what thoughts are, then how do you know other things don't have them? You don't have even a thing to judge anything by. So the guy was kind of not very bright, and was more pissed off that we were kind of calling his bluff in the fact that he was clearly saying that we couldn't know that other people's things, that we couldn't even know what thoughts are, yet here we are having a conversation. Clearly I understand him, clearly he understands me. And then when we point that out, he's like, well, that can just be an illusion. And I'm like, okay, man. So then you thinking that you think all these things is also an illusion. You go ahead and think that.
Yeah, and that kind of thinking is stupid, but dangerous, I would say.
It
Because
is.
it really is like weirdly prevalent.
Yeah, and then he got mad at us because we actually did not accept his blatant assumption in which he said like that this was the most widely accepted and most important conclusion of psychology. And then like me and the other guy who were talking, even though we don't agree, on philosophical basis of Hegel or on the understanding of Hegel, we both agree at least that psychology is nonsense, literally, and it's a dupe discipline for charlatans in the worst sense of the word. And he got so mad. And he's like, are you denying science? I'm like, but you just said that you can't even know what thoughts are or consciousness. You can't even know if you're conscious. And you're telling me you believe these other delusions of yours, it's called psychologists, or they're delusions of something called psychology.
Well,
Right.
okay, I think he has somewhat of a point because like I'm beginning to doubt myself whether he has consciousness. No, but like I do like notice people make arguments like this all the time. And like it goes to like a societal level as well, where like, oh, you can't recognize the other or understand them at all, usually meaning like, non-Western, non-white cultures, whatever they mean by that.
Yeah, and
And
it's
so like
because
you can't engage with them at all because you can't understand them. You're colonizing them.
yeah, that
This
there's
is
also
like
like this sense,
segregationist
yeah,
shit.
and it's because they have this idea that there is some kind of in itself, some mysterious noumenon that we just can never. Everything's an appearance, and you can never get at the real thing. And I'm like, this worry you have about conscious is literally a worry you should have about everything, man. You if you worry like I can't know other minds, I'm like, what are you talking about? You can't know other things. I mean, go all the way, be Kantian, be radically Kantian. Give up the ghost that there are these things that you can even know. It's not like, oh, well, I can't know that you're conscious, but I can know that this ball, is in my hand. No, you can't. By your own standards, you can't know that that's actually a thing out there, that there are actually things out there, that there even is such a thing as out there, or in here. That's just fictions of, the human mind. It's just the constructions of cognition, transcendental cognition.
Yeah, that is like exactly the problem because they're skeptical of everything, but then they're not skeptical enough because they do like rely on this assumption of the thing in itself
Yeah.
that they should be way more skeptical of.
So let's continue. Uh, so hence the failure of sympathy and the impossibility of human companionship. The existentialist self has a dream of human companionship, but never the experience. He touches others at the fingertips. The best he can attain to is an intuition of paradise. Nausea indeed exudes throughout a sense of defiant triumph of a lonesome hero similar to that of Lucifer's in Paradise Lost. Oh god, I love Paradise Lost. Like I ended up listening to it because I was interested in William Blake, and William Blake thought this was a extremely profound piece of art, not even just a piece of art, but it's also in a way very philosophical. But it's written beautifully, it reads beautifully. Like if you read it out loud and listen to it, or listen to others read it out loud, it just sounds wonderful, and the imagery used and the way that the language is twisted to say certain things is in the fictional world of nausea, the simple virtue of human interaction becomes a state of inauthenticity and human companionship a trap of bad faith. As a result, whomever acquainted the existentialist hero sets his eyes upon, the tragic and magnetic unattainability of the loved other is not presented, and neither is a terribly concrete presence of the hated other shown to us with the force which one might have expected from the author of Lettres et les Néants. Since I don't have a background in these, I'm not quite sure, about what this is specifying. See, let me read that. In the fictional world of nausea, the simple virtue of human interaction becomes a state of inauthenticity, and human companionship a trap of bad faith. As a result, whoever Quentin, the existentialist hero, sets his eyes upon the tragic, magnetic unattainability of the loved other, is not presented, and neither is the terribly concrete presence of the hated other shown to us with the force which one might have expected from the author of Lettres et les Néants. So I think I have some notion, some determinate notion of at least why, human interaction in this view would be inauthentic, and I'm not quite sure about what bad faith exactly is. Have some vague intuitions of it. I've encountered a couple Sartreans in my time. They seem to always wax very poetic and not be very clear about anything. But the inauthentic part, I suppose, is just simply that if you view yourself as constituted by these relationships, which are you can never truly have, then I can kind of see how that is indeed a form of inauthentic relation to the world and to oneself. You have a sort of delusion about what the real case and who you really are is. I don't know. Does that make sense to you, like Trey and Josh?
It does. I would just like to add, like, the nausea. I don't know if there's that kind of a cliche phrase, right, regarding that novel by Sartre, which is like, hell is other people, right?
Mm-hmm. Oh, is that what it's from?
Yeah, it's got a cliche related to it.
Yeah.
It encapsulates the spirit of the thing, and I don't know, the original name. Like, the whole thing is about melancholy, I guess you could say. I think the original title was supposed to be melancholy or something. I'm not sure. So it deals with all those kind of aspects of human interaction, right?
Mm. Oh, that sounds interesting. I did not know that. Yeah, and then where it says the tragic magnetic unattainability of the loved other is not presented. So I assume like the Quentin guy seems to be aware of this unattainability and unreality and of these interactions and they being constituted in these relationships. So, they sort of don't they don't project this onto it, and so the loved other is not presented. Yeah, that seems to make sense. On a broader, more encompassing scale, solipsism in Sartre's philosophy also manifests itself in the denouncement of the world of things and the objective reality. According to Murdoch's interpretation, Wittenstein, as the mouthpiece archetype of Sartre's existentialist hero, is a Platonist who has, however, lost the Platonic faith of the transcendental truth. He longs for the stable and solid necessity of the eternal realm of being, and his sense of nausea comes from the naked confrontation with the world of existence. Along with its chaotic contingency and its sticky substances, the everyday human world, with its rich and messy human life, is perceived as a place of degeneration as opposed to the orderly, authentic state of being that Wittenstein aspires to. This explains why, in a famous scene in Nausea, in his final revelation, Wittenstein is struck by extreme disgust when he observes the shapeless, bulging root of a chestnut tree in a park. It is exactly here that Murdoch gives her fundamental contention against Sartre's philosophy in the form of a question. Why would Sartre find the contingent everyday world with its swarming abundance nauseating rather than glorious?
Which just seems like a very it's something you find everywhere, right? In the work of Sartre, it's nausea. It's in popular, I guess, consciousness, publicly related to people relate the phrase "helps other people" to nausea, right?
Yeah.
But it's a theme that is all around every kind of writing, in being nothingness, everywhere in Sartre. He's talking about this alienating self-relation with themselves and each other, right? And so much so that the phrase itself is like from another play. It's called No Exit, where three people are in hell. They're in hell and all they have is each other, essentially, which is a the theme of like this hell is other people, the human interaction is already falsified in appearance. It's already fake. It's already never truly realizable of a person's innate, or rather construed, actually, capacity, potency, fortune, and so on. Something you find everywhere in Sartre. It's very peculiar, I think, because it's a theme that never dies in him. It never goes away.
Yeah, that makes sense, and that coheres with what we've read, and like this, like this focus on being, for example, that she notes here. That makes sense with what's been said before. That if you have this view of a self-contained individual, unrelated and unrelatable. I mean, this is literally in the logic, and I know Sartre also had this in mind, as well as Heidegger. It's being as this yet to be determinate thing, and in Hegel, being is just indeterminate, without qualification. Even the qualification of indeterminacy. Existence is literally relation. It's the relationship of being, which is not. And then I mean, what is it with Heidegger? Dasein, existence, is also sort of this nexus of relationships, in which relations first stand out, as well. I mean, like it's tricky, right, to talk about it. Relationships already are a category of existence. You can't really escape it in that way. So I see here like this sort of mystical aspect to Sartre, which now sort of makes sense of why the Sartreans that I've encountered seem to have this obsession with a very mystical relationship to this existentialist mode that they like. Okay, Continuing, we can grasp Murdoch's challenge to Sartre and the relation of their respective stances like this. Murdoch's emphasis on the concrete world of the everyday can be seen as a way to push Sartre's proposition existence precedes essence to further stages. Not only must one face the accidental, always in flux, world of existence head on, admitting that it is the human situation one was thrown into, but one also has to admit that from this situation one cannot flee. Such is the beginning and the end, and there is no final leaping off it outside the self-indulgent fantasies of one's consciousness. There is even one further stage. Not only should one admit and accept this human situation, but one should also respect and welcome it. This further stage makes an ethical appeal that one must endeavor to adopt a just and loving gaze, as opposed to Medusa's fatal gaze, to recognize this chaotic accidental world and each of the beings, especially human beings, in it, with their particularities and ungraspable alterity. So yeah, that makes sense. I mean, that's two ways that definitely you can flip existence, sort of the positive side of it and the negative side of it. And I'm definitely on the positive side of it. I think existence and its manifolds must be affirmed. With such a stance, we could also say that Murdoch in fact reverses Sartre's philosophical proposition, not that she reverses the order of existence precedes essence, of course, but in the following sense. For Sartre, the other, people, as well as the surrounding social conventions, are deemed as constant threats of alienation to the noble and lonely self. Quote, to have gone away, literally or spiritually, from the rest of humanity may be at least a step away from bad faith towards sincerity, unquote. I assume that's a quote from Sartre's works. However, for Murdoch, the alienation of humanity implies nothing but the isolation of the human subject whose flat, relentless ego feeds on solipsism. To return to the authentic world, that is, the world of the substantial and the real and here, the subject must struggle to overcome his self-indulgent fantasies and break free from quote, the grasping tentacle of the ego, unquote, so as to move to the actual outside world that is filled with otherness. Here we also get the chance for a first glimpse of what freedom means in Murdoch, which will become more important in on her second layer critique. Freedom does not mean the willfulness of the self that could think and do whatever it wants, but that one could be aware of the appeal of an other-centered concept of the real, and under the guide of which one constantly improves one's moral imagination of exterior reality and of the other. Note that, quote, fantasy, unquote, and, quote, imagination, unquote, form an important conceptual dichotomy in Murdoch. The former is a bad use of the latter, leading to solipsism, whereas the latter is a practice in the moral state. It is the effort to understand the other in a way that approaches ever closer to the truth, but never quite arriving at. That's an interesting distinction, and it makes perfect sense. For Murdoch, not only is Sartre's artistic failure in the novel the most telling symptom of his solipsistic philosophy, but it is also in the field of the novel, rather than in that of philosophy or in playwriting. Such a genre highlights the dramatic moments of action and choice which befits Sartre's philosophy, that could have provided the brightest hope for him to rectify his solipsism, had he not hurriedly said his final farewell to the messy accidental world of the novel, so full of encounters and moral conflicts and love. In the introduction, Murdoch writes, quote, I cannot help wishing that Sartre had devoted all that tremendous time-consuming energy to the writing of a 4,000-page novel about everybody and everything, unquote. In the last part of the book, after defining Sartre and existentialism as the paragon of the public spirit in the post-war era, Murdoch ends her maiden work with the following remark, quote, Sartre's inability to write a great novel is a tragic symptom of a situation which afflicts us all. We know that the real lesson to be taught is that the human person is precious and unique, but we seem unable to set it forth except in terms of ideology and abstraction, unquote. I think that's a very true judgment of society then and now. and to bring it to the aesthetic point, very early about Sartre's artistic failure in the novel uh, being the most telling symptom of his solipsistic philosophy. Uh, Definitely, you can notice somebody's deep philosophical commitments in what they write and how they write. You know, if they or the art that they create and how they create it when they try to do such things. Um, and I think that people who are like who really believe in these abstractions just tend to have like not very good aesthetic senses. You know, like like if like you really only view the world in like these particularly in the immediately abstract, which is like the singular atomistic points of abstraction. Yeah, it makes sense why you wouldn't be capable of writing a very good novel, writing a very good, compelling story, or having a very compelling philosophy. I think that those kinds of things like only become appealing insofar as one reaches for themselves like that standpoint just very very high, or rather you could also call it very very low abstraction. That when your life and point of view becomes that empty, only then does a certain standpoint like that this solipsism of a kind becomes something that both makes sense to you and becomes appealing to you. I mean, to give something somewhat related, like there's I don't know if you would call it a novel. It's a story. It's not very long. It's definitely a book. It is a book uh, called A Voyage to Arcturus, and it also seems to have this sort of negative relationship to existence, but it's not a mystical relationship to existence. It still affirms, the individual, but it's a sort of it's generally understood as a Gnostic story. But even if you have no idea about Gnosticism, and no interest in Gnosticism, you can just read that book, and it is just people seem to find two things about it. It's unintelligible nonsense, or it is like a very, very fascinating, cryptic, mystical book full of like strange.
You cut out.
Oh, hello.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, I think my headphone kind of crapped out there a little bit. Actually, give me a sec to plug it in, just so because it might be running out of battery, even though I don't think it should be, but stuff happens. All right, hopefully then that will secure that. Anyways, where was I? Yeah, Voyage to Arcturus. People tend to read it. There's like two general views: unintelligible nonsense, or it's just very fascinating nonsense, which seems to have random glimpses of just like these wonderful little passages which are deeply, deeply imaginative. And when people talk about visionary, at least in the more highly cultured sense of visionary, I mean this stuff is visionary. It's intended to have a very real meaning. It has a sense of commitment and conviction in it, which it seems like nausea lacks. at least in the positive sense. So, continuing, to attempt to write a good novel then would be a meaningful practice, not only for the literary value it provides, but also in that it is the moral imperative for the current period. But what kind of novel is regarded as great here? Nothing fancy in the criteria. The great novel simply looks like a proper novel. I agree. It contains lively events and nuanced descriptions of mental activities, abounds with vivid depictions of background details, and it deals with the unpredictability and chaos of human life with patience. Most importantly, a great novel brings about touching characters. Its characterization is of a manner that the complexity and mystery of various human beings could reveal themselves freely without too much undue interference from one single domineering consciousness. As is revealed in Murdoch's diagnoses of Sartre's fictional writing, if we are to be either touched or terrified by the fictional characters, there must be that concrete realization of what George Eliot called an equivalent center of self, from which the shadows fall with a difference. That's a very speculative proposition. The great novel Murdoch has in mind is closest to the 19th century realist novel. It is thus no surprise that Murdoch's second book, published only a year after her treatise on Sartre, is a novel that pays tribute to literary realism. Yep. Actually, I watched going back to Voyage to Arcturus, I watched the panel because this year was apparently the 100th anniversary of the novel. So there was a panel organized by I forget what university, in which one of the panelists discussed about how, despite how fascinating the story is, it's not a very good novel or a good story, in the sense that you don't really end up feeling very much for like the main character or any of the characters. There's just a sort of like, there is no living personality in the usual sense of humanity. Rather, all characters seem to have just this immediate presencing of these deep metaphysical concepts and convictions, rather than, having a sense of, these being living individuals who really have an internal and external reality to themselves, as living individuals, as feeling and as feeling, as desiring, as purposive, as communal, as all these other things. Which I can agree with that. That is indeed a failing, if one wants to put it that way. Still a darn fascinating book. So continuing, it makes a lot of sense to see Under the Net from 1954 as Murdoch's attempt to novelize Sartre's Nausea. The novel harks back to nausea frequently, especially in plot and in the image of its protagonist. The main hero, Jake, resembles Quentin greatly in the beginning. I know a certain Jake. He sometimes causes me some nausea with his bad jokes. I wonder if he'll ever know I said that. I tell him to his face. The main hero, Jake, resembles Quentin greatly in the beginning. He too is a typical existentialist youth that lives a rootless intellectual's life, neurotic, cynical, detached from the warmth of close interpersonal connections. Yet as Jake wanders through London and Paris, I'm always never sure if I should just say Paris because, that's what everybody says in English, or if I should just be like correct and say, Paris.
I don't know. Are you gonna say like the non-anglicized version of like every city ever? Like,
I don't know. Like for most of the rest of the world, that's kind of how it works. Like Paris is one of those few things in which that's not how it works. Everybody just says Paris instead of Paris. Yeah.
Portuguese just say Paris.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, we just have like, and it's usually especially true for European cities. But I guess for like other countries, like China, I don't think they call it China in China.
No,
I think
China
that's
China has a different thing. Yeah, it's an English thing.
Yeah,
and everybody
Japan as well. but like, so many cities just have a, we call München, or however it's pronounced, Munich, call, I don't know what it's called in Italian, but it's not Naples. We have all these like anglicized versions of names of cities, and I think it's fine because people know what you're talking about.
Like, do you say January River or do you say Rio de Janeiro?
I see Rio de Janeiro. Exactly. See, that always confuses. I want to be, I want to be culturally appropriate and sensitive to those things. But then, we live in Anglo-land. At least I live. Josh lives in Anglo-land. Tree lives in the unfortunate backyard of Anglo-land.
True.
Okay, that's Paris. His frustrations in the encounters with the important others in his life, close friends, women whom he loves and who love him, shatter his inner state of contempt and superiority. The interactions with those important others, along with the conflicts, misunderstandings, the pain of loss and regret during the process, eventually transformed Jake through the revelations of the other's existence and of the mental violence Jake had committed in perceiving others as he wished, rather than as how they are truly like. Such revelations could be as shocking as the experience of religious miracles. The static image writhes to come alive, blood oozing out from the marble statue, alluding to Sartre's petrified gaze onto another subject. One of the most agonizing revelations takes place when Jake loses the woman he's been in love with for years, with a belated realization that he had been distorting her character and feelings to his own favor all of that time. Murdoch here gives one of her earliest eloquent statements on love, a concept that is to become very important in her later moral reflections. This is also the crucial moment of Jake's transformation. Quote, I had no longer any picture of Anna. She faded like a sorcerer's apparition, and yet somehow her presence remained to me more substantial than ever before. It seemed as if, for the first time, Anna really existed now as a separate being, and not as a part of myself. To experience this was extremely painful, yet as I tried to keep my eyes fixed upon where she was, I felt towards her a sense of initiative, which was perhaps, after all, one of the guises of love. Anna was something which had to be learned afresh. When does one ever know a human being? Perhaps only after one has realized the impossibility of knowledge and renounced the desire for it, and finally ceased to feel even the need of it. But then what one achieves is no longer knowledge. It is simply a kind of coexistence, and this too is one of the guises of love. Well, I can agree with that to a pretty big degree. I think it's more than less correct. As we can taste directly from the above passage, the vicissitudes of tone and literary style in Under the Net are also telling above and beyond the change of the protagonist's personality. The novel starts with a cool tone and style resembling that of Nausea, yet by the end it already exhibits the features of what Gogol called laughter through tears. Laughter in the sense of Zadie Smith's comments on Jane Austen, namely that nothing is more hilarious in the British comic realism than someone who thinks he is always perfectly right. Tears from the painful experience that others are not just an idea within oneself. Other people exist out there as separate and substantial beings of whom one can never gain perfect knowledge, even those one loves the most. Eventually, whilst Nausea remains a metaphysical novel, Under the Net turns out to be a mixture of Bildungsroman and picaresque novel that falls firmly into the category of British realist fiction, despite its heavy philosophical debates and traces of influence from the sometimes overly stylized 20th century European literature. Anglo's told. Just a comment on what is it? As separate and substantial beings of whom one can never gain perfect knowledge, even those one loves the most. I think here psychoanalysis is at least one great contribution, which is the realization that this is not the case for oneself either. Not only can you not know anybody else perfectly, you can't know yourself perfectly. So, you're brought into the same uncertainty in relationship to others in yourself. So, that there's no safe haven for you to really be, solidly like self-sustained and saying, I'm my own self-grounding, after I've achieved this. There's never a point in which you truly are uh, self-transparent in absolute sense. And I think Hegelian logic actually gives a great explanation for why this is, particularly with the final unity of things in the absolute idea, which is the unified disunity and the disunified unity at the same time. The complete incompleteness and complete or incomplete completeness as well, which I'm writing something about, and I'll submit that to Epoche whenever the heck I'm done with it. I think that's actually a very interesting thing. We'll have something right like on that. Do you remember that one article I wrote on my blog, Josh? I don't know if you read it, the one about futurity. Like
yes,
I tried to get.
I absolutely remember that.
Yeah, like I tried to get a sense of like what this complete incompleteness can function like, and like how we can make sense of that. I should have submitted that to Epoche, when I think about that. It would have gotten way more exposure, and it was definitely right up the alley of what they publish.
I think Epoche should try doing podcasts, honestly, now that I think about it. Try getting some of their writers to talk to each other or something. I don't know.
No, that would be. I mean, I think like the two who do it, I mean, they do this on their spare time. Like they're professors, maybe not like full professors, but like they teach philosophy. One of them actually teaches from China. I think he's in mainland China. So that's interesting in itself. He must have a more familiarity with Eastern thought than usual. But yeah, that would actually be something like people like it. Like people are always. I always see people like on Reddit online, just kind of like asking for what are like more good podcasts. There's not that many philosophy podcasts that are either good or substantive and entertaining.
Yeah, I personally have a harder time with podcasts than with reading, but I think there's a market out there. So I think Epoche should try tapping into that.
That, or also just do like have somebody read these and put them on like YouTube listenable or podcast form. Like that would.
Oh yeah,
That would increase the amount of people who interact with these articles a lot.
You remember Cosmonaut, right? That magazine as well, kind of magazine blog.
I vaguely recall the name.
Yeah, so they kind of do something like that, where they have a podcast, but they, I guess, the publishers and editors and so on of the thing usually just have readings of the articles they publish and so on, discussions over them. And it's nice, with the authors and so whatsoever. It could be a good idea, have the author of the Epoch article come
Yeah,
discuss.
that would be something. I think they're pretty busy at the moment. That'd be a commitment. Although, like once you get things straightened out, the commitments become less strenuous. But anyways, this continues. Murdoch expresses her opinions on post-war literature more straightforwardly in one of her most famous articles, Against Dryness. In this article, she criticizes a major type of literature that appears since the 20th century, which she calls the crystalline type. It includes the European metaphysical novel represented by Nausea and L'Invité by Beauvoir, surrealist literature, experimental novels that are obsessed with exploring fancy new ideas, and the dainty modernist poetry of Pound, Hulme, and Eliot, etc. This type of literature is, quote, a small quasi-allegorical object portraying the human condition and not containing characters in the 19th century sense, unquote. To counter such a popular literary trend, Murdoch highlights the virtue of the 19th century realist novels, which do not bother so much about the human condition as an abstract topic for intellectual debates, but instead are concerned with real, various individuals struggling in society. On another occasion, Murdoch calls for the return of the realist eloquence mentioned by Henry James, and beseeches that art should continue to reflect that complexity, openness, and incompleteness of reality. I think I agree overwhelmingly with that. While I do like some really abstract stuff, at the same time, I think that just like the medium of art fundamentally works best for truly concrete situations. You know, like a not realism in just like this typical analytic notion of it, but or just trying to reproduce what empirically exists, but realism in the sense of going through what are the concrete, believable, as well as essential consequences of things. So in that you clearly have the relationship of people who must appear and act as real human beings do. Have you can't have like these inhuman characters. It just doesn't really work. And people who try that, it's somewhat interesting, but especially when they try to purposely do that, it ends up kind of boring.
Yeah, my difficulty with that idea about like what art should be is that like as someone with a great commitment towards music, of course, it's kind of not really applicable to music. I mean, it's I think music is ultimately a failure because of this, but it is like ultimately abstract, but I think it's still proper, true art.
Right. But then its point is not abstraction. Like I think, the truly most beautiful things are contentful and have a concrete reality to them. Uh, it's like this. It's like when we talk about soul. You can feel it. Like it's not empty. You can feel it, and you're like, yes, this makes sense. This change here, this transition here, these relationships here. They not only make sense logically, they feel right. They make sense intuitively as what these movements of emotion, feeling in sound are.
Yeah, but they do like ultimately like it's mostly intuitive. It's very like hard to get a specific concrete meaning from any piece of what they call absolute music. Obviously, once you have like lyrics introduced, words, you get more concrete meaning, but it's not in a musical way, I would say.
Mm-hmm. So continuing. The criticism of the crystalline literature, however, constitutes only half of the article's review of 20th century Western literature. Our picture is far from complete if we neglect the other half of Murdoch's literary reflections, especially with regards to the topic that is more pertinent to our present essay, her confrontation with Wittgenstein's. Ah, yes. A certain word that applies to Wittgenstein, but people think that it's politically incorrect, so I won't say it. Even though he totally was. You didn't see that movie. Well, did you see that movie with us, Trey? I think you've seen it. The movie about Wittgenstein for like the 90s.
I think I watched it in 2015 or 2014.
That movie's really good. I liked it.
Yeah. Is it like a biography?
Yeah. It's like
Yeah.
it's like just like mostly in black rooms, like no sets or anything. It's just like
Yeah.
mostly him monologuing, and the guy they chose to like portray him looks literally like him. And I think he was German or Austrian, so which made it even more perfect. And like, yeah, I think they very much, I think they very much showed I don't want to, I want to say it, but I'll keep myself from saying it. What is it? Her Confronting with Wittgenstein. The other type of literature Murdoch criticizes in her article is the journalistic type. In contrast to the dainty crystalline work, the journalistic one is a large, shapeless, quasi-documentary object, the degenerate descendant of the 19th century novel, telling with pale conventional characters some straightforward story enlivened with empirical facts. That's a great critique. I hate journalism like that. You know, you're reading something, it's supposed to be like telling you about something important, and it goes like, this is so and so, and she has 12 cats and 5 kids, and you know, on this one day she went to the store, and you know, she bought this latte, and she looked at it, and it dawned on her, milk comes from cows. Cows are living beings. They feel pain. And then it goes on to, you know, this pretty boring, simplistic argument about veganism, and you're like, you could have just said that I don't care about this really stupid story. Now that Murdoch has identified the philosophical counterparts of the crystalline literature to be continental existentialist philosophical tradition, to be the continental existentialist philosophical tradition that is a draw at constructing abstract theoretical systems, she also discovers the philosophical source for the journalistic literature, namely the Anglo-Saxon empirical analytical philosophical tradition. That's an interesting connection. I have to think about that. Most notably, it lies in the school of the 20th century analytical language philosophy represented by figures such as Russell, G.E. Moore, Wittgenstein, and J.L. Austin. Those philosophers usually adopt a scientific positivist view towards the analysis of linguistic phenomena and believe that both abstract philosophical questions and moral problems in the wider society could be answered or dissolved through a careful analysis of people's linguistic practices. Among this group of philosophers, Murdoch especially highlights Wittgenstein and his later philosophy of ordinary language. Before we proceed to explore Murdoch's opinions of the 20th century literature on the basis of its moral impacts, it is necessary to halt here for a while and turn to clarify the parts of Wittgenstein's thought that interest Murdoch and Murdoch's response to him. Born on the European continent, Wittgenstein nonetheless becomes a crucial figure for the 20th century Anglophone and analytic language philosophy during its development from logical positivism to the focus on ordinary language. The early Wittgenstein agrees with Russell's logical positivism on the nature of language and believes that the everyday use of language is often logically misleading. The task of the philosopher is therefore to meticulously excavate the clear logical structure behind our problematic everyday language and to preserve the ideal language with sound logic to cure the illness of our everyday language use. You know, now that I read that like that, I'd watch a movie that like had a trailer like that. However, the later Wittgenstein, to a large degree, subverts his early perceptions of language and argues that no unified metaphysical logical structure could be found in human language. Rather, human language is a vast corpus that consists of all sorts of practical human activities, that is, various language games, each with distinctive rules. Therefore, the later Wittgenstein believes that one should no longer attempt to create any theoretical system in the hope of solving once and for all the problems of language, the problems in language and in philosophy, for the chaotic phenomena in language and puzzling philosophical problems, problems in moral philosophy included, are only produced artificially when the theorists start to study language in abstraction, when language does not really do anything at all. Philosophical problems arise when language goes on holiday. Quote from Philosophical Investigations. By contrast, the correct way to solve, more precisely to dissolve, philosophical problems and to cure the so-called illness of language is to always return to the concrete cases of language practices, to bring words back from their metaphysical to their everyday use. To quote a famous figure of speech from Wittgenstein, we must bring language back to the rough ground to see how it works, rather than to keep it spinning in mid-air or sliding across the ice. Ice here refers to the crystalline purity of logic and theories. It is a later Wittgenstein's ordinary language philosophy, with its anti-theory, some even claim anti-philosophy, attitude that interests Murdoch, and she positions Wittgenstein's thought not only as a major influence for contemporary British moral behaviorism, but also at the core of the British empiricist tradition, irregardless of the soundness of these traditions. The reason for Murdoch's partiality is not hard to fathom. There is a completely different mode of thinking in the Wittgensteinian philosophy that counters both the solipsism of existentialist philosophy and continental philosophy's general inclination to construct abstract theoretical systems. So in my latest submission to Jackbook, I actually referenced Wittgenstein, particularly on this whole issue of language as use, in which I agree with that, with the only caveat that I don't think Wittgenstein went far enough, and I don't think Wittgenstein's really the one who originates the proper ground of this view. Over my years of coming back to Hegel, I've come to a sort of way in which I explain and describe his methodology as being literally the meaning of concepts is their use, and their use is the activity which thought is engaging in with them. So, the fundamental gist of what Wittgenstein's after is right, at least like with concrete things, if we were talking about like, well, what is a hot dog? This is not some metaphysical question, really. That's stupid. You want to find out what a hot dog is, look at what the process of making hot dogs is like, and what the relationship of hot dogs is to other things in common everyday language, and you'll see that why certain confusions arise, and why they're not really worth worrying about. There's no worrying about like, is a hot dog a sandwich? As far as I care, it isn't. It isn't. Doesn't matter to me.
Well, is a pizza veg?
Is pizza vegetables? According to American schools, it is. Yeah. Pizza, it's a vegetable. I don't even know how they can say that. Like the tomato sauce, it's not even real tomatoes. Like I swear, like Tree, the pizzas that they serve in school in the U.S., they're not the kind of pizzas that you buy like either at the store or at a pizza like place.
I can imagine. Yeah.
They're terrible. Like they're awful. Like the crust is awful. Like I don't know what the meat, or if that's even meat, because it's more like a plasticky tasting thing. It doesn't look like proper pepperoni or like
And
any
you
other meat.
gotta go to the Northeast someday. The pizza in Connecticut is fucking good.
Is it deep dish pizza, or what is it? Like
No,
what kind
no,
of
no, no.
pizza?
I mean,
Pizza.
it's like they call it New Haven style pizza. It's basically the same as New York style, but it's got like a charred bottom. It's like almost slightly burnt, but it's really good.
What is that other pizza that's famous? Philly? No, that's not Philly. What else? Boston? You know what I'm talking about?
But Boston isn't really famous for pizza.
Like, which is the one that people like say like it's famous for like big slices, and like you gotta fold it to eat it.
That's like New York pizza.
Oh, that's New York style pizza. Okay.
Yeah.
Uh, what is it? Isn't there like a famous place for like deep dish pizzas? Or am I
Yeah,
misremembering?
Chicago. I think Detroit, they have their own like special sort of deep dish pizza as well.
Man, that makes me want some pizza right now. I'm gonna go get
Yeah.
pizza after we're done reading this. If we finish reading this, because we're
Yeah,
barely halfway.
you're having California pizza. So
California pizza isn't so bad. I'm not going to say
it's
it's not bad, because I have no reference frame except California pizza. So I'm willing to leave my judgment suspended on that matter. I indeed have to go and taste these other
yeah, at least it
pizzas.
isn't Brazilian pizza though. Man, the videos I have seen and pictures I've seen. I'm sorry, Tree, but my God.
Can't be that bad.
I saw they like put this weird like squeeze cheese on it and shit.
So long as it tastes good. I mean, like if
Yeah,
mayonnaise tasted good, I wouldn't mind it, but I don't like mayonnaise.
no,
You don't like mayonnaise?
No, I
there's no
don't.
mayonnaise in pizza. Like, I don't know, Josh. I mean, I know the video you're talking about, and there's a lot of mimetic pizza places where they make shit up. It's pretty fucking fun. Or they put like a different toppings, and like one of them is rice and beans, and the other's like a
Yeah,
whole.
no.
Those are pretty fucking funny.
Oh,
It's
let
like,
me.
They put like
yeah.
eggs and olives on the pizza, right? Like hard boiled eggs onto it.
Don't. There's a
Oh,
pizza. There's a type of pizza called the Portuguese, right? The Portuguese pizza, which is like a topping with like shredded ham, like peas, sliced eggs. I don't know. There's a lot of different types of pizza. Like, I guess it's the
I'm looking
direct.
at this. I'm seeing like corn and peas
Yeah,
on pizza. What
yeah.
the heck?
okay.
That is
Forget the hot dog example. From now on, I'm going to use Brazilian pizza as like the example.
Yeah. I
Uh,
guess Brazilian pizza is just heavily influenced by Portuguese cuisine and Italian cuisine. So there's a lot of like different kinds of pizza. Like, I can go to an Italian pizza place in my neighborhood, and they will like just make it would be just like a family of descendant of immigrants from fucking Sicily or something, and they'll make like pizza like that region in Italy, but with different toppings, I guess.
yeah.
It's
I
very
mean, there's some weird like the New Haven style pizza. It's famous for the white clam pie. They call it. First of all, it doesn't have red sauce on it, but it has like clams over it and lots of garlic. It's okay, not my thing. But there's also the mashed potato pie. It's covered in mashed potatoes and bits of bacon. And it's actually pretty good.
Yeah, see, you don't think it's bad, but I've never eaten a pizza with mashed potatoes in it, and I don't think I would ever find one
Oh,
like
come on.
that.
No, no, it's
That
good.
seems rather. I mean, it's good, it's good, right? But there's a lot of those variations because that's essentially what pizza is supposed to be. It's like supposed to be like you know, something easy to make with what you have to eat, right? You just put it on top of the dough and put it in the oven, and bam, it's good. That's it. It's supposed to be practical and simple.
yeah, so that was an interesting tangent on the concept of pizza
Exactly.
and why Wittgenstein
Pizza's
is right. Yeah. Anyways, what was I saying? Oh yeah, I agree with Wittgenstein's the whole is. I think like that's the proper attitude to like how do we understand practical things, or not. Well, I mean that's already presupposing how we understand like a lot of the meanings behind things, which seem mysterious, and once you just look at how we both how we use them and how we do them, all of a sudden that mystery's gone. Uh, let me give you an example. Time. Time seems so mysterious until you literally just look at how we use the concept of time and how we came up with the modern concept of time. And once you look at that and you realize the relationship between clocks and the relationships between uh, the objects which are used to calibrate clocks, time ceases to be a mystery. Like, you don't have this illusion of that there's this thing called time, that somehow is independent of all things, and that, that you can move in and out through it or whatever. Time, at least then, is reduced simply to the simplicity of the difference of what you would just call spatial change.
Movement.
Now, because movement's already assuming of the time, although that is a very valid point of connection in which the immediate concrete physical reality of time is movement. And so, that's one of the earliest philosophical insights I had. I didn't even know about. Maybe I knew about Wittgenstein back then. I wasn't like. I never got like too much into Wittgenstein. I got interested in the whole idea of language as use, but I never really got into Wittgenstein himself very much. But like I had this idea of time is motion, like really early, like way back when I got into Marx, and that was like 2012. And it makes sense, at least you get the concrete physical sense, and you're no longer confused that time is this mystical thing. Now, motion may be a mystical thing, that it's beyond, like, well, what is motion? How do you explain that? You get Zeno's paradoxes. But, on the concrete level of the operational sense, all of a sudden it just becomes clear. There's no issue anymore about this weird entity called time. And it's all just based on, how we actually use the language and what the actual activities we derive that from is. And the only lack I see in Wittgenstein is that Wittgenstein doesn't go far enough and then go in and seeing that thought activity is a special kind of activity which has nothing necessarily related immediately to anything else. Unlike, me having to have like a certain set of social, historical, material conditions and cultural conditions for me to be speaking about the what is a pizza, what falls within that concept. With being, you don't really have that, like with the concept of being, like so long as you start operationalizing just from within, it's just immediate thought. A caveman could think it, a modern person could think it. It makes no difference, mainly because it's about the operationality of what is happening within that cognition, as just a cognition of itself. And that's what Hegel has above Wittgenstein in that sense. Language is use, but more fundamentally, thought is activity, and it's not just like, an activity among many, it's the activity of activities in many ways. But let's continue. However, later Wittgenstein, to a large degree, subverts his early perceptions of language and argues that no unified metaphysical logical structure could be found in human language. Rather, human language is a vast corpus that consists of all sorts of practical human activities, that is, various language games, each with their distinctive rules. Therefore, later Wittgenstein believes that one should no longer attempt to create any theoretical system in hope of solving once and for all the problems in language. There's... I already read that. Never mind. Skipping now 2 paragraphs. To explicate further Murdoch's preference for Wittgenstein over Sartre, we could make the following 2 points. Firstly, Wittgenstein's ordinary language philosophy emphasizes the externality and commonality of language. The use of human language, and thus language itself, is conceived of as shared behaviors among people in the same language community. Such is the realistic spirit, borrowing the title of Cora Diamond's book on Wittgenstein, that acknowledges the outside reality with candor and humility. Thus, it could be seen as a promising counter-spirit against Sartre's Cartesian solipsism. Wittgenstein himself denies outright the possibility of the existence of the Cartesian private language, which is in stark contrast with Sartre's position on language. For Sartre, Murdoch points out language is first of all the utterance produced by the self-enclosed consciousness. Then it serves as a usually failing medium to link one's inner thoughts with outside things. Hence the strict separation of language in the world and that of the self and the outside. Secondly, ordinary language philosophy demands that we should bring our thinking back to the rich and various everyday human life, and emphasizes that we should focus our attention on the concrete cases of language practices, also the cases of moral practices and many other human activities. It echoes what Murdoch promotes repeatedly as the nostalgia to the particular. In a way, Wittgenstein's anti-theory, or anti-philosophy, inclinations also endorse Murdoch's ever firmer determination during their intellectual career to put literature above philosophy regarding their value and moral significance for the human life. Well, I have to agree with that, at least on the fact of our social existence. Marvel movies set the ethical paradigm of Burgerland, at least in the ideal abstract sense. More so than like people having any high abstract understanding of some ethics. Because I think that's just generally the incontrovertible fact that you get ethical values and norms through osmosis and just the concrete relationships and activities of your life. It's never just really this mere concept given to you and that you suddenly just accept it. You're like, oh yes, that's rational. That's morality. No, even the very possibility of you having this standpoint of this abstract rationality of ethics requires that you already have an intuitive tendency towards those, which is not entirely always based on society as a whole, but is certainly based on your concrete relationships with other people. Like if you grow up abused and neglected, and that's all you ever are surrounded by, you are not going to come up with a golden rule unless you have some kind of like out there mystical experience that completely reverses your view on life. So you can't split this lived experience of ethical values from one's having ethical values and what ethical values one has. I mean, to put it in a concrete perspective, there's this short film. I think it's so. I don't know if you've seen it, Sri. I don't know if it's famous in. It's probably more famous outside of Brazil. It's a Brazilian film. It's called like the Spanish title is Isla de Flores, the Isle of Flowers.
I absolutely know about it. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a 12-minute short movie / documentary by a guy about a landfill in Porto Alegre in the southern regions of Brazil. It's from the 90s or the 80s even, and it follows pretty much like the whole material creation of garbage and everything that involves that supposed material aspect. It's amazing for what it is. Like you watch it and I don't know.
Yeah, I think
When I watch
like
it, I just
yeah.
feel depressed and so on.
Oh yeah, it's extremely depressing. But I mean, to connect it to like this text we're reading, it's very much I think a perfection of the intention here, in which like the art that art piece makes a better argument to the average person than all three volumes of Capital combined for the reality of what the economic system really is, what the materials reality of that is.
Right. But which is something that it's very much a Sartrean point, right? There's a actually actually there's a passage, right, where a quote from Sartre where he says, "The most beautiful book in the world will not save a child from pain. One does not redeem evil, one finds it. The most beautiful book in the world redeems itself. It also redeems the artist, but not the man, any more than the man redeems the artist. We want the man and the artist to work their salvation together. We want the work to be in the same at the same time an act. We want it to be explicitly conceived as a weapon in the struggle that man wage against evil." Like, it's this point you're making is very Sartrean.
Interesting.
There's another quote like in relation to that one, and I'm reading this because I found in Mesaro's book, The Work of Sartre, where he makes a critical reassessment of Sartre as a failing individual, not a perfect philosopher or thinker and so on, but as a person who it's a book that tells the story of Sartre as a person who knows of their limits, I guess, as a person committed to within their limits, and with in relation to that cult, Mesaros brings up another like 10 years later, Sartre writes again about that specific quote where he says, "Do you think that I could read Robert Grillet in an underdeveloped country? Question mark. And then he answers himself, facing a dying child, nausea has no weight." His novel, Nausea. This is a
Yeah,
very Sartrean point you make.
yeah, that's
I
great.
agree with it.
Yeah, that's great. Ooh, oh, I forgot what a point I was trying to make with that. Besides, like that movie is that short movie is a great instance where I think art is greater than philosophy, but there's also the what was it the link to the concrete that you can understand the system by what's concretely happening. It's not just an abstraction. So let's continue. With all her admiration for Wittgenstein, Murdoch is more positive in her comments and towards the Anglophone empiricist tradition generally, as expressed in both philosophical and artistic fields. Yet through the criticism of this journalistic literature, which conforms to many of the Wittgensteinian empiricist principles, such as observing concrete cases and focusing on particular details with great patience, Murdoch still unleashes her dissatisfaction with this school of thought. For her, the empiricist, analytical, linguistic, moral philosophy is too obsessed with the shared habits of behavior and public social conventions to the degree that it too loses the genuine singularity, the idiosyncrasy of the individual, despite its emphasis on particularity as opposed to abstraction. In this sense, the journalistic literature falls prey to similar problems as existentialist art, in that they both fear the chaos and contingency shown in the individual. Moreover, the linguistic moral philosophers Wittgenstein included share the emphasis on the outward actions with the existentialists and ignore the individual's inner moral life. Wittgenstein simply gives a cursory acknowledgement to the sphere of inner life and then leaves it with the statement that we could explain nothing about it, resulting in the same state of moral dryness as in Sartre's thought. Lastly, whereas the emerging view of language on the European continent at the time, adopted by Sartre as well as schools from surrealism to post-structuralism, tends to regard language as a complete separation from the world, hence the disillusionment with language's traditional referential function, the Anglophone ordinary language philosophy, on the other hand, completely eradicates the division of language and the world. That is, language just is activities in the world. The consequence is that there is no room left for what Murdoch tries very hard to pursue, the constituent sphere of transcendental truth, which could have served as a better ultimate moral guide beyond the totalitarian human will or flimsy social conventions. Hence, Murdoch gradually comes to the conclusion that neither of the two post-war philosophical aesthetic language schools, with Sartre and Wittgenstein as their representatives, is sufficient enough to provide a good moral foundation for the current Western world. They go respectively to two extremes, yet often betray the same problem, that they leave us, quote, far too shallow and flimsy an idea of human personality, unquote. In another article, Murdoch provides a comparison of the two approaches to humanity, linguistic empiricism and Sartre and Existentialism, by means of the depiction of two human characters. They are called the, quote, ordinary language man, unquote, and the, quote, totalitarian man, unquote, respectively. Quote, one may say that whereas ordinary language man represents a surrender to convention, the totalitarian man of Sartre represents a surrender to neurosis. Convention and neurosis, the two enemies of understanding, one might say the enemies of love, and how difficult it is in the modern world to escape from one without invoking the help of the other. Sartre's man is like a neurotic who seeks to cure himself by unfolding a myth about himself. Ordinary language man is at least surrounded by something not of his own creation, viz. Ordinary language, but totalitarian man is entirely alone. In the world inhabited by the totalitarian man, there are other people, but they are not real contingent, separate people. They appear as organized, menacing extensions of the consciousness of the subject. Ordinary language man is too abstract, too conventional. He incarnates the commonest and vaguest network of conventional moral thoughts. And totalitarian man is too neurotic. He is simply the center of an extreme decision, man stripped and made anonymous by extremity. Seems to make sense to me. Consequently, the problem of post-war Western literature in general, to conclude Murdoch's review of this topic, is that it misses the chance to envision an appropriate image of human personality in the literary work, and between the above two options, we are offered things or facts. What we have lost is persons. Yet Murdoch does not stop at bitter critique. Since the very early stage of her intellectual trajectory, she has attempted to reach a better imagining of the human personality through a critical selection and revision of the two modern branches of the Western philosophy. More often than not, it is in her novel writing, rather than her philosophical works, that her experimental thinking is presented with greater vividness and richness. Now it is time for us to return again to Under the Net, for the book is as much a novel in genre and style as a work of philosophical experiment in content, as much about Sartre as it is about Wittgenstein. The title itself gives away a strong allusion to Wittgenstein, who famously insists that one should be daring enough to crawl under the net of theory and logical structure so as to observe what is really going on. We shall now proceed to explore how Murdoch lets the totalitarian man and ordinary language man interact through dialogue, what kind of interactions and mutual influences could take place between these two men, and what new insights we could draw from such a confrontation. Reminds me of what's that movie we watched, the one about has Samuel L. Jackson and the guy who played the sheriff in like No Country for Old Men.
Snakes on a Plane?
No. It's the one where they're just in a room and like the guy trying to commit suicide.
God. I know.
Yeah, the argument.
Oh my god, it's such a great movie. Well, I know what you're talking about. Let me find it.
Yeah. I'm thinking maybe you could have a movie like that, totalitarian man versus the ordinary language man. Just having this increasing dialogue.
The Sunset
conversation.
Unlimited. That's it.
Sunset Unlimited. All right.
Limited. Very weird movie, by the way.
Yeah, I liked if I remember the ending right, it doesn't end with a resolute note. You're not sure who won the argument, who convinced who.
Yeah.
All right, continuing. It all begins with the novel's characterization. If the first protagonist, Jake, is a typical Sartrean totalitarian man, then the second protagonist of the book, Hugo, is undoubtedly a typical Wittgensteinian ordinary language man. Murdoch not only designs for Hugo a life trajectory similar to that of Wittgenstein's, but also confers on him a temperament that could personify the ordinary language philosophy. Hugo is gentle, honest, and modest. Those don't sound like Wittgenstein to me. He seems to think and talk slowly, but very profoundly when he does, with an ability to rephrase what Jake has said, either too cursory or too obscure, in some completely simple and concrete way which sometimes illuminated it enormously. Jake and Hugo are best friends and close intellectual companions, and according to Jake, the narrator, the acquaintance is the central theme of Under the Net. Jake is drawn to Hugo by his down-to-earth, anti-theorizing habit of thinking. Hugo never thinks along the lines of any general theory or ready-at-hand system whatsoever. Therefore, in his eyes, each thing is astonishing, delightful, complicated, and mysterious. In comparison to Hugo, Jake realizes for the first time the potential defect of the way he sees things. Quote, "But it was as if Hugo's very mode of being revealed to me how hopelessly my own vision of the world was blurred by generality. I felt like a man who, having vaguely thought that flowers were all much the same, goes for a walk with a botanist. Only the simile doesn't fit Hugo either, for a botanist not only notices details but classifies. Hugo only noticed details. He never classified. It was as if his vision was sharpened to the point where even classification was impossible, for each thing was seen as absolutely unique. I had the feeling that I was meeting for the first time an almost completely truthful man." The drastic difference between Jake and Hugo and their modes of thinking makes them fascinated with each other, but also causes immense difficulty for their mutual understanding. One of the most severe misunderstandings between the two friends has to do with their views on language. Jake's existentialist language view is embedded in the assumption that language and the world are completely separate, whereas Hugo's ordinary language view is that language is completely about living in the world, as has been touched upon above. And herein lies the reason why Jake would come to distort Hugo's arguments about language completely. The idea is that Jake thinks he has stolen from Hugo and put into his book, The Silencer, does not contain any of Hugo's real opinions at all. The misunderstanding is triggered by Hugo's explanation of his Wittgensteinian view on people's inner feelings. As the two friends discuss Proust's writing, Hugo insists that, quote, "there's something fishy about describing people's feelings," unquote, because when the feeling, apprehension for example, takes place inside a person, the only thing he could say accordingly rigorously to the facts might just be about his quickened heartbeats. Now you can say a lot more than that. Quote, "But if one said one was apprehensive, this could only be to try to make an impression. It would be for effect. It would be a lie." Unquote. Jake is quite shocked by Hugo's statements. He repeatedly interrogates Hugo if he really believes that there is no way to express one's inner feelings and thoughts, Jack adds. Truthfully, is verbal communication between people always false then? Suppose one tries hard to be accurate. After receiving Hugo's negative answers each time, Jake draws a natural conclusion. In that case, one oughtn't to talk. Now that Hugo also says actions don't lie, Jake then very comfortably comes to the notion of abandoning language. He puts it in his The Silencer. Quote, "Actions don't die, words always do." Unquote. Quote, "Truth can be attained, if at all, only in silence." Unquote. Quote, "It is in silence that the human spirit touches the divine." Unquote. Man who says actions don't lie hasn't acted very long. I love that with Hegel. You get complete opposite. Actions always lie. They have to lie. There's always more done in an action, often one that reflexes right back on it, which contradicts it. It's how you reach the limit, which to its opposite. You know, capitalism's action is what shows the lie of what capitalism is. You know, it's that social action taken to its full reality is what then also, as its own action, reveals its lie about what it was professing to be doing. Had Jake for one moment been able to leave the comfort zone of his conceptual premises and enter the scope of Hugo's view, he would see that language and action could essentially be the same thing. He then would never come to see these crude dichotomies of language, action, truth, falsehood, nor would he impose the conclusion of rejecting language, embracing action onto Hugo. Murdoch here mocks Jake's existentialist language and life attitude with not only the stupid misunderstanding Jake has made, but also more profoundly with the thinking process such attitude leads to, in contrast to the Wittgensteinian one right beside it. Jake's harsh, arbitrary judgment on language that is manifested in the silencer is exactly the crystalline type of work. The logic is as such, since language cannot truly convey what the subject thinks and feels within him, then the subject, for the sake of protecting the authenticity of his consciousness, better speak as little as possible. Eventually, such a view on language boils down to Sartre's Cartesian solipsism. Language is first and foremost regarded as a means of inner meditation for the isolated subject. Once uttered out, it is inevitably faced with the risk of degenerating to the idle talk of das Man, to borrow Heidegger's terms. Consequently, the authentic inner state of the self would be contaminated by outside prejudices, which leads to the bad faith of the subject. It is also worth noting here that such a solipsist language view seems to be shared by a wide range of existentialist philosophers. Heidegger, too, highlights the purity of language use, and it is no wonder that his favorable form of verbal art is poetry. When Heidegger proposes that man dwells poetically in language, he seems to view language as more of a channel for giving monologues toward being than as a medium to communicate with other human beings. I don't even know if his poetry is translated, but I had read some comments that Heidegger's poetry is pretty bad. On the other side of the picture, Hugo's Wittgensteinian attitude toward language clearly bears resemblance to that of the journalistic work. He records, ponders on, and interrogates every single thing and idea meticulously, with fantastic patience, for every opinion Jake expresses, Hugo would confirm over and over again, to make it precise. He is no silencer. So when Hugo says that language will produce lies when it starts to describe inner feelings, what he adopts is in fact Wittgenstein's critique of the notions of private language and inner life. The reason in here is that the various human feelings, emotions, and consciousness should not be seen as some cryptic experience inside the individual's spiritual life at the outset. The individual seeks to express them with the correct words. Those terms are just like other terms in human language. They are public behaviors conducted under publicly accepted rules. Where this is not the case, people never escape the labyrinth of abstract philosophical reasoning. This is not to imply that Wittgenstein denies the human mind's inner activities, but the language of feelings should not be seen as some set of decontextualized tags to be stuck to some non-verbal actions. They, the language and the action, are from the beginning to the end in one. When a person cries out that he is in pain, he is in pain. The verbal signs he gives out have the same efficacies as other natural actions such as moaning or shaking. Those in the same language community, upon receiving such verbal signals, would know what they should do is to step up and offer help, rather than standing by and meditating whether that person is telling the truth or not. That would be another language game under another rule. But what lies beyond the scope of the common life, that is, the goings-on inside an individual's mental mechanism, are beyond the limits of language and any future language philosophy. They could only be seen as mysterious processes and be left in silence. Hence Wittgenstein's famous proposition, what can be said at all can be said clearly, and whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. That is also why Hugo himself sometimes seems to endorse Jake's rejection of language, but he actually never does. What about Murdoch's criticism of Wittgenstein here, and of the journalistic literature? It is indeed more difficult to see clearly Murdoch's criticism of them in comparison to her strong negative emotions of Sartre and the crystalline literature. The affection Murdoch shows in her characterization of Hugo, in her undistinguished admiration of Wittgenstein, both reveal that she accepts Wittgenstein's position to a very large degree. However, Murdoch in Under the Net still mobilizes Jake all the time to counterbalance Hugo's stances, indicating that she is still somehow not satisfied with him. Hello?
Yeah, I can hear you.
I would venture to say that Murdoch feels with Wittgenstein, and with British empiricism generally, is mostly a sense of regret. A, quote, regret, unquote, is not a, quote, mistake, unquote. It does not stimulate fierce attacks, yet it could also be as fatal, if not more so. A mistake, however severe, always stands a chance for correction, yet regret is often caused by lack. One has to leave for somewhere else to find the missing thing. What ordinary language philosophy lacks is exactly the thing that could be found in Jake. It is what makes him feel shocked and unacceptable when he hears that human language understanding has to halt before people's inner life. It might be wiser to accept the conclusion with a down-to-earth empirical posture that our language and our thinking can only remain in silence when we come to the realm that's beyond their limits, and not suffer it. But this would mean the denial of the fact that there is always the impulse of imagination in a human being. This is exactly why the ordinary language of man also misses the real picture of the human character. Murdoch says, to be a human being is to know more than one can prove, to conceive of a reality which goes beyond the facts in a familiar and natural way. Unquote. Where the empirical thinking cannot reach the fact, there the wings of imagination could bring us closer to the height of the real. For Murdoch, it means we should not comfortably join the ordinary language philosophers in their calmness to be satisfied with the notion that truth and falsehood are only consensus of a language community. We should aspire to something higher than that. We should keep good a realm of otherness that is exterior to both oneself and the shared human society. He keeps longing for beings that are irrevocably separate from him. Jake feels a sense of initiative towards Anna. He thinks that is a guise of love. The saint, however, is far too sober and self-sufficient. Near the end of the novel, Hugo gives a piece of advice to Jake. Quote, some situations can't be unraveled. They just have to be dropped. The trouble with you, Jake, is that you want to understand everything sympathetically. It can't be done. One must just blunder on. Truth lies in blundering on. Unquote. These words require the reader to digest critically. It is true that one could only blunder on to reach truth, or more like fact in Hugo's context. Yet Jake's impulse to understand everything sympathetically should not be denounced, even if it will only end in heroic defeats. In the novel, Hugo eventually suffers the same fate as Jake. He too is helplessly drawn into the chaos of love. He too has experienced the pain of longing for someone other than himself, of trying to approach the loved one's mysterious transcendence that results in failure. This might be the most tender and most solemn of punishments that Murdoch could ever arrange for her character. The punishment from Eros. The theme of love, Eros, or Eros in Murdoch's thoughts is a crucial one that deserves another full essay to unravel. Discussing it in depth will lead to Murdoch's deeper critique of the foundations of Western moral views, the liberal tradition, the meta-ethical stances of humanism. For the present essay, though, we have already seen the major enemies of love. Murdoch points out in her confrontation of Sartre and Wittgenstein, the neurotic existentialist hero and the conventional ordinary language man. Both personalities fail to picture moral life properly, but they indicate a new possibility for moral improvement by way of selective combination of these two, which leads Murdoch to define herself as a Wittgensteinian Neo-Platonist later on. Yeah, it makes sense to me. Dostoevsky says in The Brothers Karamazov, through the confession of the youngest brother, that it is much easier to love people abstractly, as ideas. Yet when people present themselves all too concretely, with their solid corporeality, their peculiarity, their idiosyncratic way of thinking and doing things in one's everyday life, love becomes immensely more difficult. Such symptoms of solipsism and fear of peculiarity are still very common in our contemporary world. And that is why it is still pertinent to take heed of what Murdoch said today, more than half a century later. Well, I agree with the sentiment. Can't say I find very much that's disagreeable in everything we read. Like, because it's still more of a developing account. So I don't feel that you can really go like, oh well, here at this point I think that's wrong. Well, it's still yet to be completed in its full account. I can only anticipate the second half. I'll see. I don't know if it's already been published or it will be published. I'll check. I found it interesting. I don't know very much about Sartre, but the stuff that you brought up about Sartre was very elucidating. Thank you. That was very interesting.
This article is very comfortable.
Yeah,
I really liked it.
yeah, and then Murdoch's position seems interesting. That that she's straddling these two extremes, which I think is always the proper intuition. That somehow there's got to be truth to both sides, and there's got to be some way to bring them together to some extent. So yeah, I liked it. I think she's a very good writer. Flows very well, reads very well. Uh, Not boring. But all right, that was it. So that was reading and commenting. How long did that take? That took about like what, maybe 2 hours. Yep. So for those of you who watched, see you around.